I faked my own kidnapping to manipulate my toxic family, but someone else took over the game. What started as a carefully staged disappearance turned into something far more sinister. Hidden cameras, psychological warfare, and an audience I couldn't see. They were watching us, studying us. I thought I was the one pulling the strings, until I realized I'd become the star of someone else's experiment. And by the time I tried to escape, I wasn't alone. This isn't just a revenge story, it's a blueprint for control. And the final act? Let's just say, not everyone makes it out. Welcome to the Skillful Art of Manipulation podcast. If you haven't already, please consider following us on your favorite podcast platform. Today we present to you, Staged and Stolen. Let's dive into this thrilling narrative together. Chapter 1. The Art of Disappearing. It started with a turkey knife. Not the disappearing. That came later, carefully orchestrated and riddled with petty revenge fantasies. But the first moment I wanted to vanish came that Thanksgiving, 2 years ago, when my mother gripped a carving knife like it was a scalpel, and the bird was her patient. She made delicate slices with surgeon precision, lips pursed, pearls around her neck reflecting the soft golden hue of her curated dining room. Her eyes never lifted from the meat. "Dark or white, Delilah?" She said it like asking for a preference was a favor, like she hadn't just spent 20 minutes ignoring my presence completely. "I don't care," I murmured. She served me white anyway. Dry, of course. Not that I had any appetite left. My brother, Everett, was mid-rant about cryptocurrency. Again, something about decentralized finance being the next frontier and how we, meaning Dad, needed to jump in before his business partner, Caleb, beat him to it. Everett's voice had that slick, eager tone he always used when trying to pitch an idea, like a startup founder who'd just done a line of something expensive in the guest bathroom. Dad wasn't listening. He never really listened to Everett. He just swirled his wine and stared past him, into the void of his own growing obsolescence. The once golden boy of mid-tier tech acquisitions now reduced to stock options and awkward toasts. And me? I just sat there unseen. Not literally, of course. They knew I was there. My chair was filled. My plate was full. I even wore the stupid dress my mother had sent over the week before, navy silk, sleeveless, tighter than I liked. But none of them looked at me. Not really. I was a placeholder. A formality. And that's when the thought landed. Soft at first. Almost silly. What if I just vanished? Not forever. Just long enough to matter. I swirled the cranberry sauce on my plate like blood in a crime scene and smiled. The kind of smile no one at that table would ever notice. And that was the moment. The precise second my little fantasy stopped being a passing thought and became a plan. It wasn't impulsive. I'm not impulsive, no matter what my mother tells people behind closed doors. No, I was methodical. Precise. A perfectionist raised in a house where mistakes weren't just corrected. They were punished with silence and disappointment. So I gave myself a timeline, 2 years. Enough time to make it look real. Enough time to make it feel earned. I started small. Planted seeds. First came the mental health angle. I leaned into it, subtly. Canceled plans. Talked vaguely about panic attacks in group chats. Started seeing a therapist, an actual one, for 6 months. Not to get help, but to build a paper trail. I mentioned childhood trauma during our sessions. Threw around words like emotional neglect and undiagnosed anxiety disorder. I cried sometimes, just enough to be credible. Next, I isolated myself. Gradually. Skipped family gatherings. Responded to texts with one-word answers. Became flaky. Let them say it behind my back. Let them whisper it into cocktail glasses and clink toasts to how much of a mess Delilah had become. Let them believe I was fading already. It made the disappearance feel inevitable. When I found the cabin, I knew it was fate. 45 minutes outside the city, nestled at the edge of a long-forgotten road behind a stretch of overgrown forest. It used to be someone's hunting retreat back in the 80s. There were beer cans in the crawl space and a rusted cot in the corner. I cleaned it up, reinforced the door, bought supplies in cash from a gas station 3 towns over. Granola bars, water, a solar charger, a cheap laptop, a burner phone, a sleeping bag, and a bottle of good wine. Because even fake kidnappings deserve flair. The final detail? The ransom note. I spent weeks drafting it. It had to be just the right mix of desperation and threat. Enough to trigger panic, but not so violent it invited deeper scrutiny. I decided on $500,000, an amount big enough to wound their wallets, but small enough not to raise federal eyebrows. I set the delivery for Dad's birthday week. Symbolic. I always hated his birthdays. He used to throw Gatsby-level parties for himself and act surprised when no one remembered mine. It felt poetic, giving him a gift he wouldn't forget. The morning of my disappearance was clear and cold. I left the apartment wearing my running gear. Pinned my hair back. Took a deep breath before slipping into the trees behind the park trail. I made sure the camera caught me on the way in. That mattered, a breadcrumb. The illusion of routine. I had already planted the scene. A torn sleeve snagged on a bush, a bloodied shoe in the grass, a smear of blood on a nearby rock. Not much, just enough. The blood was mine, a carefully sliced palm wrapped in gauze once I got to the cabin. I disappeared by mid-morning. By lunch, the media had my name. It was strange watching your own disappearance go viral, like attending your own funeral without the hassle of being dead. The headline was clean and dramatic. Tech heiress vanishes on jog, police investigating possible abduction. My college photo was everywhere. The one with the soft smile and stupid flower crown. I hated that picture. It made me look like the kind of girl who bakes muffins for bake sales, not the kind who stages her own kidnapping. But it served its purpose. My family gave their statement on the third day. All standing there, unified. My mother in black, like mourning me early. Everett choking out a plea for my safe return. Dad saying nothing, eyes watery in a way that looked sincere, though it was probably just the flashbulbs. And I didn't know if I was being punished or simply replaced. They paid the ransom on day 5. No hesitation. $500,000. Transferred to the crypto wallet I'd set up through 3 layers of VPN and 2 fake IDs. I stared at the confirmation on the burner phone and laughed out loud. Not because it was funny, but because it worked. They believed it. They wanted me back. They needed me back. I had won. I was supposed to reappear 3 days later. Disoriented. Dirty. Rattled. I'd cry on camera, mumble something vague about a blindfold and a dark room, and maybe even mention a smell, gasoline maybe. Something gritty and vivid. I would be fragile but strong. Broken but healing. A survivor. It was all rehearsed. Practiced. But the night before my big comeback, something changed. I woke up in darkness. No, not darkness. Stillness. Wrongness. My laptop was gone. So was my phone. The emergency key I kept hidden beneath the warped floorboard missing. And the door, which I had always locked from the inside, now bolted from the outside. Panic didn't arrive all at once. It came in steps. First, confusion. I rubbed my eyes, thinking maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe I'd misplaced the phone. Second, denial. I retraced my steps. Checked the windows. Whispered my own name like a prayer. Third, the note. Taped to the window, flapping slightly in the draft from the broken pane. 1 line. Thick black marker. No signature. Nice try. My turn. I read it twice. Then a third time. The words didn't change. And suddenly everything slowed. The air got thinner. My lungs got smaller. I sat down hard on the edge of the cot, palms sweating, heart thumping so loud I swore I could hear it echo off the walls. Someone knew. Not just about the cabin. About the plan. About me. And they were close enough to lock the door without me hearing. Close enough to watch. Close enough to wait. I wasn't faking it anymore. This wasn't pretend. Someone had taken my story, my beautiful, controlled, dramatic narrative, and hijacked it. Chapter 2, The Locked Room. There are only 2 types of silence in the world. The first kind is soft, gentle, the kind you sink into like warm bathwater. Solitude, peace, the quiet hum of nothing. The second kind, that silence is heavy, dense, the kind that sits on your chest like a weight. You can't sink into it, it sinks into you. That silence isn't the absence of sound. It's the presence of something else. Something watching, waiting. That's the silence I woke up to. I sat on the edge of the cot, gripping my knees, listening. Not breathing too hard. Not moving too much. I told myself it was a mistake, a lapse. That I'd misplaced the phone. Forgotten the lock. That I'd wake up fully in a minute and laugh at my own paranoia. I'd always had a flair for the dramatic, hadn't I? But my phone was gone. My laptop too. And the note taped to the window was not a dream. Nice try. My turn. The handwriting was neat, clean, even a little whimsical. Not the jagged, angry scrawl of someone unhinged. It was the handwriting of someone enjoying themselves. That's when the dread started to coil in my gut, like smoke in a closed room. The cabin had only 1 door and 2 windows. One window was too small to crawl through. The other, the one with the note, was just big enough for someone to reach through, maybe even climb through if they were determined. I tried it first, naturally. The lock was jammed. Old. Rusted. It wouldn't budge. I pressed my face to the glass, but all I saw were trees. Endless trees. I shouted. Once. Twice. A scream that cracked in my throat and came out sounding more like a gasp. No answer. Only the birds. That was when I tried the door. I knew the second I touched it that it was no longer mine. I yanked on the knob, slammed my shoulder into it. Nothing. They'd reinforced it. From the outside, locked in my own hideaway, caged by my own crime. The irony was almost poetic. I paced for hours, tried to retrace the last day, the last hour. Had I fallen asleep too deeply? I'd been drinking. Not much, just a glass or two from the bottle I'd brought to celebrate my ransom payment. Had someone drugged it? Was I that careless? No. I was careful. Always. Unless they'd been here longer than I knew. The thought hit like a slap. My eyes darted to the floorboards, the corners of the room. Had someone been inside already? Watching me? Waiting? I dropped to my knees and pulled up the loose plank where I'd hidden the key. Empty. No signs of struggle. Just absence. They knew exactly where I kept it. That made my stomach twist. That meant they weren't guessing. They knew. They'd studied me. Watched me. Maybe for days. Weeks. Which meant it could be someone close. Someone familiar. My breath caught in my throat. Was it Everett? My brother? He was always sharp. Jealous, too. Had a competitive streak that turned ugly under pressure. Or was it my father, deciding that a fake kidnapping was too perfect an opportunity to disappear a problem child? Or my mother? She had asked if I was okay more than usual the last time we spoke. Of course, that was 2 months ago. She'd always preferred absence to confrontation. I searched the room like a detective in a cheap noir film. Overturned everything. Mattress, bedding, floorboards. No bugs. No wires. No hidden cameras. But there was something new. Tucked into the far corner, where I kept my supplies, a plastic container that had not been there before. It was sealed tight, labeled with tape. My name was written on top. Delilah. I froze. Every cell in my body screamed at me not to open it. But I did. Inside were 7 items. A toothbrush. Mine. A photograph of me asleep in the cabin. A recording device. One I hadn't brought. A single earbud coiled in the box. A granola bar. The same brand I'd stocked. A vial of something pale pink and unlabeled. And a note, folded neatly at the bottom. The note read, "You were never alone. Let's play a game." I dropped the container so fast the photo fluttered to the floor like an accusation. My face, slack, vulnerable, mouth slightly open. I was under the blanket, one hand exposed. I remembered that night. I'd had a dream. Something about falling. Was that when the photo was taken? Had they been inside the room with me? My stomach churned. The walls of the cabin seemed to inch closer. The granola bar sat there innocently, but I couldn't bring myself to touch it. The vial made my skin crawl. I wasn't about to taste test an anonymous pink liquid from a stalker with a flair for theatrics. The earbud, though, the recorder, those were tools. Clues. I picked them up. The recorder powered on. No passcode. Just one file. I pressed play. The voice that came through was distorted. Processed. Genderless. "Hello, Delilah. You're doing better than I thought. Most people panic faster. But then you're not most people, are you? You're the girl who faked her own kidnapping to see if anyone would come looking. Turns out they did. But here's the twist, darling. Now you're actually missing. And no one's coming this time. Because the story's already been written. The ransom's been paid. The daughter's safe. The chapter's closed." The recording paused for a beat, then resumed. "I think we'll get along beautifully. But first, let's play a game." Click. Silence. I couldn't move for a solid minute. My brain short-circuited. Logic tried to catch up to what emotion already knew. This wasn't a random stalker. This was someone inside the story. Someone who'd read the script and decided to edit it. They'd taken my lie and made it truth. And now I was trapped in the narrative I created, with someone else writing the next page. I shoved the recorder away and leaned against the wall. My breathing came in shallow waves. I tried to calm myself. I'd planned for worst-case scenarios, weather emergencies, twisted ankles, power failures. I hadn't planned for this. I'd wanted control. That was the point. To orchestrate something for once in my life. To make them look at me. To make them see. Instead, I was locked in a cabin with an invisible puppeteer, no escape plan, and the sickening realization that I was no longer the author of this story. I was just the protagonist. And I didn't know if this was still fiction or the beginning of something real. Chapter 3. The Mirror Moves. The days stopped coming in full shapes. They used to arrive in familiar outlines, morning, noon, night, marked by the sun bleeding through the cracked cabin window or the growl of my stomach telling me I'd skipped a meal again. But now time dripped like honey from a torn jar, slow, sticky, senseless. Sometimes it was bright when I woke. Other times it was pitch black and freezing. I stopped trusting the light. It had started lying to me. That's how I knew the game had begun. Or maybe that's when I began to lose. The rules weren't clear, just implied, like invisible ink waiting to be revealed. But the voice on the recorder hadn't come back. Neither had the person who left the box. Or, if they had, they made sure I wouldn't catch them. I started to catalog everything. Not out of strategy. Out of desperation. Day 1, I think. I slept in 1-hour bursts, waking each time in a cold sweat. I'd dreamt of the forest swallowing the cabin whole, trees growing through the floorboards, roots wrapping around my legs, pulling me into the dirt. I woke up screaming once. The echo startled even me. The plastic container remained in the corner, untouched since I first opened it. I kept checking it like it might change when I wasn't looking. It didn't, but something else did. The photo was gone. The picture of me sleeping, the one that proved someone had been inches from me, had vanished. At first, I thought I'd moved it, misplaced it in the haze of my panic. I tore through my things. Nothing. It had been right there, I was sure of it. That was the first time I said something aloud, just to break the tension building in my own head. This isn't funny. I didn't know who I was talking to. Maybe I was talking to myself. Maybe I was hoping the walls would answer. Day 2, maybe. The granola bar had moved. Not far. Just slightly off-center from where it had sat inside the container. I'd memorized the layout by then, like a sick little still-life portrait. The bar had been flush with the edge of the Tupperware. Now it was askew. Tilted. Rotated 90 degrees. It was small. Meaningless, really. Unless it wasn't. Unless someone had come back inside, just long enough to nudge it. To watch me find it. To see how long it took me to notice. I didn't eat that day. I wasn't sure if I was starving myself or protecting myself. I just knew the food looked off. My own supplies, the ones I'd brought and hidden in the locked cabinet beneath the cot, were untouched. But my trust in them was broken. I couldn't remember if I'd counted the bottles of water. Were there always this many? Was that one missing? Was this one slightly lighter? I sniffed each bottle like a paranoid chemist, trying to detect the scent of poison or bleach. Nothing. Just stale plastic. I didn't drink. That night, I woke up to the door creaking. Not opening. Just creaking. It was probably the wind, but I sat up anyway. Eyes wide, blood pounding in my ears. I whispered, "I know you're there." No one answered, but I swear I felt the silence shift, like something had paused to listen. Day 3, if I'm counting right. I began hallucinating. At least, I think I was hallucinating. The mirror, the old cracked rectangle nailed above the small sink, moved. It wasn't much. A subtle tilt. But I knew the angle. I'd been looking at my reflection every day, watching my face become more hollow, my eyes more sunken. And suddenly it was off by an inch. I stared at it for an hour, not blinking, waiting to see if it would move again. It didn't, but it was wrong. I tested it, reaching up to shift it myself. It wobbled slightly. Loose nail. That was all. Unless someone had shifted it for a better angle. Unless they were watching me, through it. I tapped the mirror. Nothing. I unhooked it, flipped it over. The back was plain. No cameras. No wires. No cracks. Just me, and the growing seed of fear that my mind was cracking before the mirror ever would. I left it off the wall. That night, I heard the recorder beep. It had been off for days. Dead battery. I hadn't touched it, but it beeped. Once. I scrambled over to it like a child lunging for a nightlight in the dark. A new file had appeared, just 10 seconds long. The voice was different now. Still filtered. Still anonymous. But softer. Mocking. "Delilah, you're slipping. You were so careful. Now look at you." There was laughter. Quiet, almost fond. Then static. Then nothing. I punched the wall. Hard. The pain helped. Blood welled on my knuckles, proof I was still here. Still real. I cried after that. Not loudly. Not like the dramatic sobs you see in movies. No, it was the kind of crying that leaks out, slow, reluctant, shameful. The kind you try to swallow but can't. I curled up on the cot, shivering under the sleeping bag. I imagined the walls breathing. I imagined the door cracking open. I imagined someone standing at the foot of my bed, smiling. I squeezed my eyes shut and told myself this was still a game. That I could still win. Sometime later, the day I lost track entirely, the walls had writing on them. It wasn't there before. I swear. Tiny etchings, barely visible unless the light hit just right. I ran my fingers along the grooves in the wood. Names. Dozens of them. Some old. Some newer. Clara. Devin. Anya. Nate. Eloise. Mikey. B. Ford. Delilah. Mine was the freshest. Carved cleanly. No dust. I hadn't done it. That much I knew. That meant someone else had. And that meant this cabin, my cabin, the one I'd found, cleaned and claimed, had a history. I wasn't the first. I wouldn't be the last. That realization split something in me. I laughed. Actually laughed. A sound that echoed too loudly in the tiny space. And then I started talking to the cabin. I don't know why. I just needed to hear a voice. Any voice. You picked the wrong girl, I said. You think I'm weak. You think I'll break. But you don't know me. The walls didn't answer. But something outside scratched at the door. Not a knock. Not an animal. Scratching. Deliberate. Slow. Like a finger dragging across wood. That night, I dreamed I was back home. At the estate. In the dining room. My family sat around the table, smiling, glasses raised. But their mouths weren't moving. The smiles were wrong. Like dolls. Painted on. Plastic. I tried to speak, but had no voice. My mother reached across the table and placed something in front of me. It was the granola bar. Unwrapped. Half-eaten. The bite mark was mine. I woke up gagging. In the haze of whatever day it was, I realized something awful. This wasn't just a game of fear. It was a game of control. Every time I noticed something had moved, it meant they'd been watching. Every time I questioned my memory, they got stronger. They didn't want to kill me. They wanted to unmake me. They wanted to take the one thing I'd always tried to keep for myself. The story. The truth. The narrative. They were rewriting it. From the inside. And I was the unreliable narrator in my own horror novel. I took the mirror, the recorder, and the earbud. I piled them in the corner. I spoke to the recorder like it was alive. If you're listening, I want you to hear this. You haven't won yet. You think you can scramble my brain, twist my timeline, starve me into submission. But I see you. I see what you're doing. And I'm going to find a way out. I built this plan. You hijacked it. But it's still my story. I didn't expect an answer. But I left the recorder on anyway. And slept with my back to the wall. One eye open. Chapter 4. The door that opens. There's a moment that comes after too much silence. A particular kind of madness where even hope feels hostile. I hit that moment sometime after I'd carved my name into the wall with a broken fork tine, maybe the 4th day without real food, or the 6th, or the 9th. I couldn't keep track anymore. My internal clock had surrendered. Hunger buzzed behind my eyes like static. My reflection in the unhooked mirror looked like someone who'd been abandoned in a fever dream, pale, gaunt, lips cracked and swollen. I'd stopped speaking aloud by then, even to the recorder, even to the walls, because the walls were starting to talk back. Not in words, no, in gestures. A chair that moved half an inch overnight. A single drop of water in the center of the floor, even though the ceiling didn't leak. My sleeping bag shifted just enough to suggest someone had stood over me while I slept, maybe even tucked a corner of it in, motherly and precise. I woke one morning to find the toothbrush from the container sitting on the sink. Wet, as if someone had used it. I hadn't brushed my teeth in days. I hadn't dared. And then the door opened. No sound. No creak. I just turned around and it was open. The lock disengaged. The frame slightly ajar. A crack wide enough for air and possibility to slip through. I froze. Everything in me screamed not to trust it. This wasn't how freedom looked. Freedom should have come with panic, noise, crashing and clawing, and the taste of blood. This was polite. An invitation, not an escape. Still, I crossed the room. Slowly. Each step heavy, like walking underwater. I reached out and pushed the door with 2 fingers. It opened another inch. Then 2. No shadows. No figure lurking on the threshold. Just the forest. Still and disorienting. Mossy. Unfamiliar. I waited, breath caught in my throat like a trapped animal. Nothing moved. No voice. No command. No mocking applause. So I stepped outside. The world didn't feel real at first. The air was cold, too cold for the season. The sky looked overcast, bruised, but the trees were glowing green, almost unnaturally vibrant. Like they'd been painted in after the fact. I took 10 steps from the cabin before I realized I didn't recognize the terrain. That should have been impossible. I'd picked that location myself. Scouted it. I had maps, photos, coordinates. I'd lived there. For weeks before the staged disappearance. I knew every tree, every bend in the trail. But this forest? This wasn't the same. It was similar. Familiar adjacent. But off. The trees stood too straight. Too uniform. No fallen branches. No animal tracks. No signs of wind or age. I knelt to touch the ground. The soil felt smooth. Not muddy. Not wild. Like it had been curated. Manicured. Like a set. I kept walking. I didn't run, not yet. Not until I was sure this wasn't another trap. I moved with the quiet, measured pace of someone in a dream they didn't want to wake from too soon. The silence was heavier outside than it had been inside. No birds. No breeze. Not even the buzz of insects. The deeper I walked, the more convinced I became that I hadn't escaped at all. I'd been relocated. Eventually, I came to a clearing. In the center was a single folding table, covered in a red and white checkered tablecloth, like something from a picnic scene in a catalog. On it sat a laptop, powered on, waiting. Next to it, a glass of water, and beside that, a slice of birthday cake. Chocolate, with a single unlit candle. I stared at it for a long time. The candle was blue. The same kind my father used to put on our cakes growing up. Not store-bought. Custom. A particular brand he liked, sturdy wax, slow burning. The same candle from his birthday party last year. I stepped closer. My name was iced onto the cake in looping white script. Happy return, Delilah. I reached for the laptop. The screen glowed to life without prompting. A video file autoplayed. No start menu. No timestamp. Just the image of my family's dining room. Our actual one. Not a replica. Not a recreation. The camera sat at the head of the table, positioned perfectly. Almost lovingly. My mother sat on the right. In black again, pearls around her neck, hair pinned. Everett was across from her, tapping nervously at his phone. Dad was missing. I leaned closer. The timestamp was dated the day after my ransom was paid. I turned the volume up. My mother's voice cut through the static. Do we think she's coming back? Everett scoffed. You paid. She'll crawl home eventually. Probably make a whole thing out of it. Emotional damage, trauma, whatever angle she's working. She's not the only one who's suffered, my mother said flatly. She made us look like fools. Then she smiled. Not a grieving smile. Not relief. Satisfaction. And then my father's voice echoed from behind the camera. You're both wrong. The frame shifted. The camera panned. And there he was, standing in front of it, holding a glass of scotch. Smiling. Directly into the lens. At me. I know you're watching this, Delilah, he said. I had this little hunch you might try something clever. I always said you were dramatic, but I have to admit, staging your own kidnapping? That's bold. Inspired, really. But you underestimated us. His voice was calm. Patient. The way he spoke to clients he was about to crush. I built my legacy on leverage. You think I wouldn't recognize it when my own daughter tried to weaponize it against me? He swirled the scotch. Tapped the rim of the glass twice. I admire your initiative. I do. But I can't let the world think I got played by my daughter. Not when there's a boardroom full of men who already think I'm slipping. He walked back around the table, sat down in my seat. Consider this your performance review. You wanted a spectacle. You wanted to see what we'd do. Well, he raised the glass. Here's your answer. The screen cut to black and was replaced by 3 words in bold white text. You're not done. I screamed then. I picked up the cake and hurled it. It hit the table, exploded into the dirt. The laptop teetered. Fell. Cracked. The glass of water shattered at my feet. They knew. They all knew. They weren't searching for me because they never needed to. Because they'd found me first. Because they'd decided to turn my scheme into theirs. A punishment. A power play. I dropped to my knees, hands in the dirt, and laughed. Loud. Harsh. The sound bounced back from the trees like it didn't belong to me. I didn't know what was real anymore. What if the cabin had always been a trap? What if the whole thing, my plan, my disappearance, was something they allowed? Had they followed me? Had they helped? What if they wanted to make me feel powerful long enough to tear it away? What if this was my father's version of parenting? His legacy. Domination through precision. That night, I didn't go back to the cabin. I wandered. Aimless. Cold. Starving. I found another structure deeper in the woods. A wooden shed, smaller, locked from the outside. Padlocked. Heavy chain. I pressed my ear to it. I heard breathing. Not mine. Someone else was inside. I whispered through the crack. Hello. The breathing stopped. Then a voice. Shaky. Ragged. Are you real? I backed away. The game wasn't over. It had just evolved. And now I wasn't the only piece on the board. Chapter 5, The Other Locked Door. At first, I thought the voice was in my head. It was faint, broken like static on an old cassette, and wrapped in just enough desperation that I didn't trust it to be real. I stood outside the wooden shed for what felt like hours, staring at the padlock, listening to that ragged breath on the other side of the door, and wondering how many tricks the mind can play before it finally breaks for good. Are you real? The voice had asked. The question echoed through my chest like a ricochet. I didn't answer right away. I couldn't. My own throat felt too raw, my lips too swollen from dehydration to form syllables. I hadn't spoken aloud in a day. 2. Time had become unmoored, distorted, a film reel melting in the projector. I pressed my palm against the rough grain of the door. I think so, I whispered. But I might not be. A long silence followed. Then the voice came again, this time quieter, sharper, like it was threading its way through a mouth full of cracked teeth. Tell me something only a real person would say. That gave me pause. I could have said anything. Some clever quip, some darkly poetic line. But I didn't. Instead, I said the most honest thing I'd said in weeks. I'm scared. And then, like a lock tumbling into place inside the doorframe, the voice exhaled. So am I. Her name was May. Or at least, that's what she told me through the slat in the shed door. Her voice was thin and frayed, like it had been chewed on. She spoke with the careful caution of someone who hadn't used her vocal cords in days. Or weeks. I crouched beside the door and asked her how long she'd been there. Her answer was immediate. I don't know. Just like me. That's when I knew she was telling the truth. The sun had dipped into the trees by the time I found a stone heavy enough to batter the chain. It wasn't ideal. It wasn't even smart. If this was a game, I could be setting off an alarm. But instinct took over. I couldn't leave her. I couldn't not try. The stone was jagged, blunt on one side. I gripped it with both hands and started swinging. The first few hits did nothing. Just noise. Just resistance. But I kept going. Not because I believed I'd win, but because I needed to act. I needed to take back even a shred of control. May didn't speak while I worked. Just waited. And when the chain finally gave, with a metallic shriek that sounded like a scream, she still didn't move. Not until I opened the door. She was thinner than I'd imagined. Short, skeletal, wrapped in layers of old flannel and thermal pants that hung off her like costume pieces. Her hair was matted into thick, greasy coils. Her eyes, when she finally lifted them, were enormous and sunken, pupils dilated like she hadn't seen light in weeks. But it was the way she smiled that told me she was still human. Not happy. Not hopeful. Just grateful. Like a prisoner being acknowledged for the first time. She stepped forward slowly, like she expected the floor to fall through. When I reached for her hand, she flinched, but let me take it. Her skin was cold, paper thin, bruised at the wrists. But she was real, and we were no longer alone. We sat by a hollowed-out tree trunk that night, close enough to the wreckage of the shed to feel protected, but far enough away that it didn't feel like a trap. She drank from the flask I'd filled with the last of my water, and passed it back without speaking for a long time. The woods around us remained unnaturally quiet, but with May there, the silence didn't feel as loud. Finally, I asked, "How did you get here?" She looked at me, then tilted her head. "You tell me first." So I did. Not all of it, not yet, but enough. I told her how I staged my own disappearance, created a narrative to manipulate my family into showing their true colors, how the cabin had been part of my plan. I told her about the ransom, the burner phone, the fake blood, the carefully constructed scene. And then I told her how someone hijacked the whole thing. How I woke up one morning and realized I wasn't in control anymore. May didn't flinch. When I was done, she nodded, almost like she was proud. Then she said, "Your family? Did they know what you were planning?" I shook my head. I thought I was ahead of them. "You weren't." "No," I said bitter. "I really wasn't." May's story was similar, but worse. She hadn't staged anything. She was simply part of something. She used to work for a boutique digital security firm. One of the companies my father had absorbed years ago through a shell acquisition. She'd been the lead developer on some kind of privacy protocol he'd wanted to bury, one that could have made data theft practically impossible. He made her sign a contract with enough legal barbed wire to keep her quiet. When she pushed back, quietly, discreetly, she disappeared. No press. No search party. Just gone. And she woke up here. In the shed. No explanation. No ransom. Just containment. Why didn't you scream? I asked. She smiled, cracked and dry. I did, but only at first. Then I realized no one was listening. The reality hit like cold water in the face. I'd thought this was a punishment, an elaborate revenge. But it was practice. I wasn't the first test. I was just the first one to script it myself. And my father had used it against me. He'd let me stage my own entrapment, and then absorbed it, repurposed it, personalized it, the same way he did with everything. I felt sick. This was bigger than humiliation, bigger than family dysfunction. This was his legacy. Control, silence, disposal. May and I slept in shifts that night. Not that either of us slept well. I watched the trees, scanning for movement. Every snapping twig made my pulse spike. Every whisper of wind became a breath in my ear. And I kept thinking, if he'd done this to her, to me, how many others? How many missing women had never made the news because they'd disappeared into this? A man like my father wouldn't waste time with violence. He'd erase people with precision. Emotionless. Surgical. We were glitches in his system. And he was debugging us. In the morning, or what I assumed was morning, we returned to the table in the clearing. The cake was gone. So was the laptop. But the tablecloth remained blood-stained. Not from a wound, but from the icing. Smeared like paint. On the ground, a new message carved into the dirt. Final act coming soon. May crouched beside it. Ran her finger over the letters. Then she looked up at me. He's setting the stage. I nodded. And he thinks he's still writing the ending. We didn't speak after that. We didn't need to. We were already rewriting the script. Together. Chapter 6, Surveillance Fatigue. They say when you stare at a camera long enough, it starts to feel like a mirror. I didn't believe that until the third morning after we found each other. After the cake disappeared, after the message was carved into the dirt, after I stopped dreaming in linear time. I sat on a moss-covered stump, hair hanging in thick knots down my back, and looked straight into the clearing. At nothing. And still I knew I was being watched. It wasn't a feeling anymore. It was a certainty. Like gravity. Like hunger. Like grief. And it was time to start watching back. May was the one who suggested the trap. Not in so many words, but in the way she crouched low and started sketching shapes in the dirt. Circles. Arrows. Vantage points. We didn't have paper or pens, but she used a stick like a stylus and the forest floor like parchment. She didn't speak much, she rarely did, but when she did speak, it was clean. Precise. There's no wildlife, she muttered, drawing a line between the shed and the cabin. None that we've seen. I nodded. No bugs. No birds. No rustling in the brush. May looked up at me, dead serious. That means controlled environment. You think we're in a dome? Not a dome. A perimeter. Enclosed woodland. Staged terrain. Could be miles wide, or just a few acres looping. I almost laughed. It was too much, too surreal. A fabricated forest, like something out of a simulation. But I didn't laugh. Because she was probably right. And I'd been wrong about everything else. We began mapping. We couldn't draw it, not exactly, but we could document what felt off. Repeated trees. Identical bends in trails. Rocks that changed position between visits. Paths that ended in nothing but mist. Every detail we noticed became part of our language. Red moss meant the trail looped. Flat air meant cameras were close. Bird sounds. Recordings. We caught the same caw 3 different times, perfectly spaced from 3 different directions. It wasn't nature. It was a soundscape. A soundtrack to keep us off balance. I stared at the canopy for hours that day, searching for speakers. Drones. Lenses. Nothing. Which meant they were hidden underground. Or in us. We tested our theory by speaking in code. We'd sit by the shed and talk about escape, then sneak toward the opposite side of the clearing instead, seeing if our watcher would anticipate the words or the actions. It took 3 tries, but we learned something. Every time we said run, the forest lights would dim. Not visibly, but subtly. The shadows would shift. The air would go cold. Someone was adjusting the environment in real time. Someone was always listening. Not just watching. Listening. So we stopped speaking entirely. We started using stones to mark plans. 3 rocks by the fire pit meant meet here. A triangle meant watch for camera. 2 twigs crossed in the dirt meant something moved. By the end of the day, we'd built a silent system. A resistance in symbols. And that was when things started to break. That night, May found the hatch. She tripped over it while collecting wood. A soft depression in the dirt, too square to be natural. We dug it up with our hands. No tools. Just desperation and grit. It was shallow, only about 2 feet beneath the surface, and sealed with a metal panel. No handles. No hinges. Just a touchpad glowing faintly in the dark. She touched it. It beeped. Red light. No access. No keypad. No way in. Just a wall pretending to be a door. But the fact that it was there, that there was something beneath us, changed everything. This wasn't wilderness. This was a lab. And we were the experiment. We returned to the cabin the next morning. Reluctantly. Quietly. I hadn't stepped inside since the day the door opened on its own. But now that we'd seen the hatch, we needed more context. More clues. Anything we'd missed the first time. The inside of the cabin was exactly as I'd left it, and somehow wronger than ever. The air felt staged, like someone had sprayed it with synthetic pine scent. A mood, not a scent. The mirror was back on the wall, but it had been wiped clean, not a smudge on it. The sleeping bag was folded, not neatly, just enough to say, "We were here. We touched this." And on the table, where the burner phone had once sat, a new object, a chess piece. The queen, carved from pale ivory, smoothed with wear, perfectly centered on a black velvet square. I stared at it, didn't touch it. May hovered behind me, breathing slow. "They're mocking you," she said softly. "Queen piece. Power illusion." I nodded. "They still think I'm playing their game." Her eyes flicked to mine. "Are you?" "No," I whispered. "I'm rewriting it." We turned the cabin upside down that day. Every floorboard, every beam, every seam in the wall. Behind one panel, we found a camera, hidden behind a sliver of rotted wood. No wires, wireless, clearly. Small. Matte. The size of a thumbnail. It was angled at the cot. May ripped it out with a knife she'd made from a broken fork and a splintered chair leg. Her hands didn't even shake. The next morning it was back. Same model. Same angle. Fresh. We weren't just being monitored. We were being studied. Every reaction. Every adaptation. They wanted to see what we'd do next. We gave them a show. That night, I pretended to scream at May. We staged a full-blown meltdown. I knocked the chess piece off the table, tore at my hair, screamed until my voice cracked. May played scared, ran from the cabin, slammed the door. We separated for 3 hours, long enough to reset the narrative. Then we met behind the fallen oak and dug into the soft earth beside the second camera we'd found. This one had a transmitter. We buried it in mud and leaves. Next time they tuned in, all they'd hear was dirt. The forest had become our theater now, and we were writing a tragedy. But not for us. Later that night, we found a third camera. In the tree. It blinked at us just once, before the lens shuttered itself. We'd triggered something. A reaction. The perimeter lights dimmed. The silence shifted. A speaker crackled, just briefly, and we heard the voice again. The one from the recorder. But now unfiltered. A man's voice. Smooth. Calm. Faintly amused. "Impressive," it said. But too late. May grabbed my arm. We ran. We didn't run far, only to the shed. Not because it was safe, but because it was familiar. Inside, we found a surprise. A new note. Handwritten. Clean paper. Pressed into the dirt where May used to sleep. "Finale, live audience. Be ready." Below it was a photo. Printed. Glossy. My face. From 2 days ago. Staring into the woods. And behind me, faint, almost translucent, was the reflection of someone else in the mirror. Tall. Shadowed. Smiling. But it wasn't my father. It wasn't anyone I recognized. Which meant it wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about design. And we were trapped in someone else's masterpiece. Chapter 7, the final act. You'd think I'd be used to being watched by now. After everything, the cameras, the mirrored forest, the manipulated light, the carefully curated Hunger Games of my own design turned inside out. You'd think there wouldn't be any tension left to wring from it. That the idea of being observed would have numbed itself out, faded into white noise. But that was before the lights came on. That was before I walked out into a clearing lit by floodlights, so bright they bleached the world into grayscale. Before I heard the static pop of hidden speakers warming up and saw the shape of an audience I couldn't see, but felt. They were out there. I knew it. Just beyond the perimeter, past the illusion of trees, behind the glass I now suspected surrounded us. Watching like it was all performance art. A psychological exhibit. A morality play wrapped in skin. It was time. The finale. The note had said, "Finale, live audience. Be ready." But how do you prepare for something you didn't write? That's the part that burned the most. I had designed this. This was supposed to be my narrative. My show. Expose the family. Make them sweat. Make them pay. Get the ransom. Return triumphant. Retire from emotional labor forever. But I'd been outmaneuvered. Not just intercepted, recast. First as victim. Then as exhibit. Now, as villain. The stage was absurd. A platform built from wooden planks nailed into the forest floor. Lanterns ringed the perimeter, hanging from invisible cords that swayed with no wind. The center of the platform held 2 chairs. One for me, one for May. I didn't remember walking toward it. We just ended up there, drawn by a rhythm beneath our feet, a pull in the bones. Like gravity had been replaced by choreography. May's face was unreadable. She walked like a condemned woman, not scared but resigned. As if she'd seen this before in her dreams, and was now just moving toward the punchline. I sat first. The moment I did, the lights shifted. Focused. And the screen descended. It came from above, like an executioner's curtain, massive, seamless, silent. Hanging in midair, like it was projected from some invisible rig. The screen flickered once. Then a face. My father's. Smiling. "Delilah," he said. "Look at you." So composed. I didn't respond. Not because I didn't have words, but because the sound of his voice was the final trigger. Like the last bullet in a chamber you didn't know you were holding to your own head. He leaned back in his chair, some luxurious study, judging by the leather and the whiskey behind him, and folded his hands. "I owe you an apology," he continued. "Not for this. For underestimating you. You were always creative. Bold. But I didn't realize until now how much like me you really are." May flinched beside me. I turned to her. She wasn't looking at the screen. She was looking past it, at the walls beyond the lights. And I saw the truth hit her before it hit me. There were more chairs. Not just 2. Rows of them. Filled. With people. They weren't clapping. They weren't speaking. They were watching. Stone still. Some wore suits. Others lab coats. A few in military fatigues. One woman wore a conference badge around her neck. Their faces weren't lit, but I could make out the glow of tablets in their hands. Monitors. Data. Metrics. They were studying us. Every twitch. Every glance. Every shift of breath. We weren't in a story anymore. We were in a case study. And the finale was a presentation. "Your little experiment," my father said, "inspired us." The word "us" didn't land gently. It wasn't a royal plural. It was collective. Corporate. Scientific. Systemic. He gestured behind him, toward a screen that split into 4 feeds. Camera 1, me in the cabin, curled in sleep. Camera 2, May in the shed rocking back and forth. Camera 3, a wide angle of the clearing, with 2 black-suited men resetting props. Camera 4, a new woman in a third enclosure. Young, blonde, pacing like a caged animal. May gasped. I leaned forward. "Who is she?" I asked, voice hoarse. "She's your control group," my father replied smoothly. "She didn't fake her kidnapping. She didn't manipulate her family. She didn't try to steal money. She just ran away." He paused, tilted his head. "And yet, you 2 behave almost identically. Interesting, isn't it?" That was it. That was the game. Not punishment. Proof. He was building a system. A method. Quantifying trauma. Measuring control. They were watching how we unraveled. How long it took us to turn against each other. How fear bred creativity. Or madness. Or both. I looked at May. Her face was pale. Her hands clenched. She whispered something so faint I almost missed it. "They're not going to let us go." The lights dimmed. And then, for the first time in weeks, music. A slow, classical piece. Something chamber style. Strings and sorrow and an elegance so at odds with the dirt beneath our feet it made my skin crawl. From the far side of the platform, a door opened. A man stepped through. Not my father. Someone younger. Smiling. He carried a clipboard. Walked like a teacher about to collect homework. He approached May first. Subject B, 63 days. High compliance. Low aggression. Medium resilience. Restructure viable. He reached into his coat. Pulled out a syringe. May screamed. I moved, fast, instinctual, grabbed the chair and cracked it across his face before I even registered my own movement. He dropped. Hard. The music stopped. The lights flickered. And then the real chaos began. The audience stood. Not rushed. Not panicked. Organized. Men and women in masks began moving toward us from the periphery. Slow, calculated. Security? Scientists? Program directors? It didn't matter. I grabbed May's hand and ran. Back through the clearing. through the trees that weren't real, past the cameras, past the stones we'd used to signal each other. I heard footsteps behind us. Shouts. But no gunfire. No alarms. Just footsteps and breath, and the pulse of surveillance like a second heartbeat behind my ribs.